Meng Wanzhou's legal team is making a fresh appeal to the federal government. Her lawyers have published a letter saying Canada should drop its extradition case against the Huawei CFO, calling it without merit and palpably political. Canadian officials arrested Meng back in December on a request from American authorities. Relations between Canada and China have gone downhill since. Today's letter from Meng's lawyer has been sent to the Minister of Justice, David Lametti. So should Canada consider the request? Peter MacKay served as Minister of Justice from 2013 to 15 under the previous Conservative government. He's now a partner at Baker McKenzie Law Firm and joins us from Toronto. Hi, Mr. MacKay. Great to see you again.
Hello, Vashi. Good to be with you.
Let's start off with this letter and sort of your general reaction. In it, the lawyers argue a number of things, but first they really assert that no similar extradition request has ever been entertained by Canada, essentially making the case that this is unprecedented. Your take on that?
Well, look, I can tell you as a former Attorney General, there were a lot of extradition requests that come in, and I suspect that that's still the case with Mr. Lametti. However, this one is certainly without precedent given all of the different political dynamics and all of this surrounding issues. The fact that we are caught between essentially two warring superpowers, and the fact that we have Canadians in jeopardy inside China, the fact that we have this issue around 5G that is very much tied into the company and the individual, Ms. Wanzhou, who is at the center of all of this, makes it a very complicated matter, to be sure. But let's go back to basic principles. We have an extradition treaty with the United States of America, and it is charges, a 13-count indictment that emanates from the United States that has led to the arrest of Ms. Wanzhou in Canada and led to now a judicial process that is underway. The irony, that, as I see it, in the letter coming from her counsel is there's allegations of this being political. Well, for the Attorney General to essentially now intervene in an ongoing court process would make it even more so, and it would be a political disaster for the current government, given recent developments in cases involving SNC-Lavalin and Admiral Norman.
Yeah, I want to ask you about the sort of politics of it in a second, but just first also get your take on some of the arguments that they put forth. One of them is that there's no double criminality in this case, that what Ms. Meng is alleged to have done wouldn't be considered a crime here in Canada. Are they wrong about that?
Well, technically they're not wrong in the sense that the United States has now pulled out of a treaty that was in place with Iran, and Canada hasn't. But the bigger, more important question is, would the Attorney General of Canada be acting legally at this point to exercise the authority that is vested in his office, but basically to stop this extradition hearing? Because there is also an important consideration here when it comes to the rule of law, and that is that we respect international treaties. And so there is the double criminality argument is a novel one. It is one for a judge to consider, but the interjection of politics here, I would suggest, would breach another element of the rule of law, and that is respecting this international obligation that we have to follow through on our commitments in the extradition hearing.
As Justice Minister, what does Minister Lametti, at this point, or just anyone in that role, have a mechanism by which they could intervene? Like I remember we talked to you before, and there was a point at which he had to sign off on certain things. Does that point still exist, or has the time passed and now it's just really solely in the courts?
It does exist. It would be an extraordinary exercise of his power to do so. But yes, there is the capability. I think that would be without precedent, quite frankly. And the fact that it involves Iran and the escalating tensions that are going on in Iran and the United States adds a whole other complication to the current situation and I would say our broader obligations to our allies, including the United States of America, at this moment in time. So there are many elements to this, but strictly legally speaking, and answering to your question, yes, our Attorney General, Justice Minister could intervene.
Politically, though, I mean, you've been in those shoes, given the conversation that you've highlighted around the rule of law and the way in which this government so often has said, tried to get the message out, look, we're a country of the rule of law, this is an apolitical process that's occurring right now. If they were to answer this letter in the positive, what kind of political ramifications would there be?
Well, I think there would be a lot of fallout, and it would certainly revive the spectacle of what happened in the SNC-Lavalin case, where the Prime Minister's office is alleged to have obstructed and intervened directly. The same allegations around the Admiral Norman case. Here it would infuriate the United States of America at a critical time when we're asking for their help with China, when we're asking for the President to intervene on behalf of consular cases involving Canadians. We have trade implications, obviously, now with the fallout from this case, with sanctions on Canadian pork and canola, potentially other products. So the legal team for Ms. Meng Wanzhou is doing their best, and they're arguing the case arguably in the public court by making this letter public and by putting this request out there. She has very able counsel. They're going to do everything they can to protect her interests and promote her case. They're going to have charter implications to rely on. This case, I suspect, is going to take a very long time. It's going to go well beyond the electoral period that we're in right now, leading up to this election. So I think our foreign minister, Chrystia Freeland, quite rightly quashed this idea when she said we're a rule of law country. We can't water that down, and I agree with her. Just as having an envoy like former Prime Minister Chrétien go and try to argue this case and him suggesting publicly that we should just cancel the extradition, that would be political suicide, in my opinion.
Reportedly, that's what the Globe's reporting. He didn't say it directly, but I take your point. You mentioned Minister Freeland. I'm wondering, I'm sure you've been following, as we all have, the sort of conversation around whether or not we can even talk, anyone from the federal government can even talk to someone in China. And right now, it appears that those calls are going unanswered, completely ignored, actually, by the Minister of Foreign Affairs counterpart, by the Prime Minister's counterpart, and the list goes on and on and on. What do you think the government should be doing right now? Because you mentioned the trade dispute. There's all of those consequences. There's also the consequence that those two gentlemen, Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig, remain detained in China.
And the others who are facing death penalties for more serious charges. But Vashi, I may have even mentioned this to you. I think first and foremost we should name a new Canadian ambassador to China. That's not to take anything away from the head of mission who's filling in on the job, but even if we named him and gave him that official sanction, I think that is an important part. And we need to continue to call upon our chambers of commerce, our businesses in Canada who are engaged in China, those who have other contacts, former ambassadors, former politicians. All of that can help. But I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but I think that this is now at a point where it is going to take the intervention, ironically, of President Trump and the U.S. administration to try to pressure China. And I would add to that list other members, leading presidents, prime ministers within the European Union, other countries like Australia, the UK, which are very much inward-looking and wrapped around the axle on Brexit. But we need a full-court press in the Western world to say to China, this is not going to be tolerated. And we, as nations of the world, are going to band together and resist your attempts at strong-arming Canada, because it could happen to any other country. We're being made an example of, Vashi, to state the obvious. And I don't think that any country should tolerate being pushed around this way, diplomatically or otherwise.
Okay, I'll leave it there. Thank you so much, Mr. McKay. Pleasure having you on. That's Peter McKay, former Justice Minister, of course.
We have an extradition treaty with the United States of America, and it is charges, a 13-count indictment that emanates from the United States that has led to the arrest of Ms. Wanzhou in Canada and led to now a judicial process that is underway. The irony, that, as I see it, in the letter coming from her counsel is there's allegations of this being political. Well, for the Attorney General to essentially now intervene in an ongoing court process would make it even more so, and it would be a political disaster for the current government, given recent developments in cases involving SNC-Lavalin and Admiral Norman.
That was former federal Justice Minister Peter MacKay reacting to a new letter from Huawei executive Meng Wanzhou's lawyers. They're asking Canada to end the extradition process against her. Meng's lawyers claim the case came about due to, quote, political purposes as opposed to legitimate criminal law enforcement reasons. The idea of dropping the process has been floated by others, including reportedly former Prime Minister Jean Chrétien. So how likely is Canada to do so, and what are the risks if the government stays on its current course? Time for the Power Panel. In Calgary, Stockwell Dave, former Conservative Cabinet Minister. Brad Levine of Council Public Affairs joins us from Edmonton. And in Montreal, former Quebec Liberal Cabinet Minister Yolande James. Hello, everyone. Great to see you. Stockwell, I'll start with you. Do you think politically there is any way the government could even consider something like this at this point?
Well, Vashi, I don't know if I'd ever said that I would see the day where I would lean towards an opinion of former Prime Minister Jean Chrétien and away from my friend and colleague Peter MacKay. The fact is there is some room at a certain point in time. The act is clear for ministerial discretion, depending where the thing is in the court process. And it says discretion is allowed, even if there can be some political considerations. President Trump has made this a political issue by commenting a number of times that this particular individual could be used as barter in a trade negotiation. That is what gives a window of opportunity if the minister wants to declare it. Now, in terms of declaring, I should declare that I'm on the board of a telecommunications company, TELUS, and Canadian telecoms. Most of them use Huawei products, so I just want to put that out there. But that still comes back to this discretion is clearly in the act, and President Trump has made this political. Should our farmers continue to pay a terrible price for this particular detention, and should the government allow some discretion? The U.S. is not paying any price for this. They should at least step up. You know, President Trump, I understand he makes other countries pay for certain things. We're doing this at their request. At the very least, there should be some consideration, maybe on the U.S. side, on compensation for Canada paying a big price to detain this person.
Yolande, what message, though, would it send to China? I mean, in retaliation for the arrest of Meng Wanzhou, we've seen 2 Canadians arrested in China. As Stockwell mentioned, all of those trade consequences. What message would just dropping the case send to China?
Yeah, we can't confuse both of them in the sense that they are directly related, in that there are, and very serious with respect to the 2 Canadians in China. I hear the fact that China is squeezing us economically, whether it's canola, pork, and so forth. I understand that. But for the government, and not to confuse things even more after stock is leaning towards Jean Chrétien, I'm going to lean more towards Stephen MacKay on
it's
this.
Opposite day.
We're off the rails. Not only would it be confusing, I think it would be a huge mistake for the government to try to even attempt to walk that back. One, because the issue of judicial independence has been stated, not only and reiterated from the very beginning of the extradition process. And if if she wanted to plead political interference, that plaidoyer should be done in the extradition process in front of the judge at the hearing, and that assessment should be made judicially. But the message, to answer your initial question, that I would send to China, if we were as a country to say, hey, okay, we'll walk this back, it's like, just bully us, and we'll be able to interfere in our political process and in our judicial process. And what does that say to other extradition processes that are undoubtedly going to occur within our country? That what you have to do is squeeze us enough economically, and we are prepared to intervene into our process. I think Chrystia Freeland said it best when she said we're either a country of a rule of law or not. We can't be just doing that without grounds. I think it would be an extremely dangerous precedent that we shouldn't play around with.
Does Stockwell have a point, though, Brad, in that essentially that President Trump made this political in the first place by connecting the idea of a trade deal with dropping the case, that the two could be linked in the first place?
Yeah, well, but I don't think that's good enough. I don't think that taking Donald Trump's position on this is good enough, and nor should it override the rule of law. Clearly, the lawyers for Meng feel that legally they may not have all of the ground solid to stand on, because why else would you ask for the get out of free jail card from the minister, from the Attorney General, who does have the authority, as Stockwell mentions, and I don't believe it's been used in the past, but it's certainly something that is undisputed. But it suggests to me that maybe they feel that legally they're not on good ground, so therefore exempted. But using the terms national interest and the fact that we've gone against the Americans during the Iraq War suggests to me that they're trying to say that this is obviously political and not legal. So I don't believe that there's enough there to do that. If we did that, it would set a precedent that if you trade with us, if we have interests, like, and it's hard to see, those farmers who are going to be hard hit with tariffs, and certainly the Canadians who have been put in jail in China. Those are difficult things to deal with. But I think it would be worse if you start to say, okay, we'll exempt the extradition in order for you not to give us those tariffs and to release Canadians. The last question I would ask is, why now? Why, it's been now 7 months, why 7 months later are we saying that this is the political and the minister should do it?
Well, the top of the letter referenced Jean Chrétien's comments.
The
right?
minister,
So
well, then
it had been the speculation.
Former prime minister. I mean, I know, and his words obviously are going to be a big headache for this Liberal government because that's not the direction they wanted to go into. But just because a former prime minister says here's a good idea doesn't make it one that the government of the day should follow.
Quick final word to you, Stock. A lot of this is obviously in the lead up to the G20 this weekend. All eyes on the president's meeting with President Trump with President Xi. The question, of course, was raised at that White House meeting last week if we will be advocated for or whether the president will raise this with President Xi. What do you think?
Well, it should be raised. And it should be, we should remember what I'm talking about is in fact within the definition of our rule of law.
Yeah, the Justice Minister can.
And I think, I think
can and should are two different things.
I think we should be asking President Trump, since we're taking it really on the chin in a pretty tough way at his request, is he willing to look at compensating our farmers just as he makes, and I'm not arguing with that, other nations pay for certain costs that the U.S. assume in cases.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video. Thanks for watching.